The morning of November 23, 1943, over Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, Flight Petty Officer First Class Shigeo Matsushita gripped the control stick of his Mitsubishi A6M5 Model 52-0 fighter and watched the American fleet below with growing unease. For 2 years, pilots like him had owned these skies. The Zero had been invincible, capable of outmaneuvering anything the Americans could throw at them. But today, something was different. The formations climbing toward his squadron from the carriers below moved with a weight and purpose that spoke of power rather than grace. Those aircraft were larger than the Grumman Wildcats he knew how to fight. Their silhouettes carried a brutish confidence that made his instincts scream warnings his training did not recognize. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Within minutes, 30 Japanese fighters would engage what looked like inferior numbers of American aircraft. By sunset, 29 of those Zeros would be smoking wreckage scattered across the Pacific, and only a single American fighter would be lost. The mathematics were impossible. The outcome was undeniable. Something had changed in the American arsenal, and Japanese commanders from the Solomon Islands to Rabaul to Tokyo were about to receive reports that would shatter every assumption about air superiority they had built since Pearl Harbor. Back in December 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft had torn through Pearl Harbor like a sword through paper, the Zero fighter had represented the cutting edge of naval aviation. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and entering service in 1940, the A6M achieved performance that seemed almost magical to Allied pilots who first encountered it. The aircraft could turn inside anything, climb faster than physics seemed to allow for, its small engine, and possessed a range that let it escort bombers on missions spanning hundreds of miles. Early American intelligence reports struggled to believe a single aircraft could combine all these capabilities. At just over 6,000 pounds fully loaded, the Zero achieved its remarkable performance through ruthless weight savings. The airframe used minimum-gauge aluminum throughout, with no armor protection for the pilot and no self-sealing fuel tanks. Every component was engineered to the absolute minimum structural requirement with zero safety margin. The 940 horsepower Nakajima Sake radial engine, modest by American standards, could propel this lightweight fighter to speeds around 330 miles per hour and sustain climb rates that left heavier Allied fighters wallowing below. But the Zero's true advantage lay in maneuverability. With a wing loading of just 23 pounds per square foot compared to over 30 for most American fighters, the Zero could execute impossibly tight turns. American pilots in early 1942 quickly learned that any attempt to dogfight a Zero at low speeds ended with tracer rounds punching through their cockpit from impossible angles. The combination of aircraft and pilot quality created devastating results through the first year of war. Japanese naval aviators entered combat with training that was extraordinary by any standard. The competition to become a naval pilot was so intense that in 1937, only 70 candidates were accepted from 1,500 applicants, and just 25 graduated. These men spent years perfecting their craft, accumulating thousands of flight hours before ever seeing combat. By the time they attacked Pearl Harbor, many Japanese carrier pilots had combat experience from operations over China, where they had honed tactics against inferior opposition. The result was a force of supremely confident aviators flying superior aircraft. In the battles of early 1942 across the Coral Sea in May, Midway in June, the Eastern Solomons in August, Japanese pilots consistently outflew their American opponents, not always through numerical superiority, but through the combination of better-trained pilots and more maneuverable aircraft. The Americans flying F-4F Wildcats, a capable but outmatched fighter, developed defensive tactics like the thatch weave simply to survive. Survival, not victory, became the realistic goal. Commander Masatake Okumiya, serving as an air operations staff officer at Rabaul through much of 1942 and into early 1944, watched this superiority firsthand. A 14-year veteran of the Japanese Navy with over 2,000 hours flight time, Okumiya had participated in most major Pacific carrier battles and understood both the tactical brilliance of Japanese naval aviation and its growing vulnerabilities that few in the high command wanted to acknowledge. His post-war writings would reveal that even at the height of Zero dominance, perceptive officers recognized the model was unsustainable. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had devastated Japanese carrier aviation not through American tactical superiority, but through the loss of 4 fleet carriers and many of their most experienced pilots and deck crews. The carriers could be replaced given time and resources. The pilots could not. Where American training programs were rapidly expanding to produce thousands of new aviators annually, Japan's selective system continued filtering candidates through the same rigorous program that had worked brilliantly in peacetime but could not scale to wartime losses. By late 1942, replacement pilots arriving at Rabaul and other forward bases showed distressing gaps in training. Okumiya noted complaints about the quality of replacement crews as early as the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. The problem accelerated through the grinding attrition of the Guadalcanal campaign from August 1942 through February 1943, where Japanese naval aviation lost aircraft and pilots at rates the training system could not match. Experienced aviators were pulled from training billets to fill frontline squadrons, which further reduced the quality of subsequent replacement pilots in a death spiral of declining capability. Through this period, the Zero remained technically superior to the F-4F Wildcat, but the gap was closing. American industry, having studied early combat reports, was developing fighters specifically designed to counter the Zero's strengths while exploiting its weaknesses. Intelligence gathered from intact or partially damaged Zeros captured in various locations provided crucial insights into construction methods, performance characteristics, and vulnerabilities. Most importantly, in June 1942, a nearly pristine Zero had been recovered from Akutan Island in the Aleutians after its pilot, Tadayoshi Koga, died in a crash landing that left the aircraft fundamentally intact. Through the summer and fall of 1942, American engineers and test pilots systematically analyzed that captured Zero, documenting every aspect of its design and performance. They discovered that while the Zero dominated in slow-speed turning fights, it had critical weaknesses. The control surfaces became increasingly heavy and unresponsive above 200 knots. The structure could not handle high acceleration loads that American fighters shrugged off routinely. The engine, using a float-type carburetor, would quit under negative acceleration. Most importantly, the lightweight construction meant battle damage that merely inconvenienced American fighters would catastrophically cripple a Zero. This intelligence flowed to Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation on Long Island, New York, where engineers were finalizing a new fighter design. The first timing was perfect. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat had begun development in mid-1941 as an improved Wildcat, but by April 1942, before the Zero was even captured, Bureau of Aeronautics had directed installation of a much more powerful engine based on combat reports from the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare, fresh from earning the Medal of Honor defending the carrier Lexington, toured Grumman on April 22, 1942, and emphasized that American fighters needed one thing above all else: a plane that would go upstairs faster. The F-6 F-3 prototype fitted with the massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double Wasp engine first flew on July 30, 1942. That was just 26 days after the Akutan Zero was discovered, but 2 months before it would be restored to flying condition and tested. The Hellcat was not designed because of the captured Zero, but as the new fighter moved toward production through late 1942, detailed intelligence from the Akutan aircraft allowed Grumman engineers to refine specific design elements. The final F-6F incorporated lessons learned from studying every aspect of Japanese fighter design. Where the Zero saved weight through minimal structure, the Hellcat accepted greater weight in exchange for ruggedness. Where the Zero relied on maneuverability for survival, the Hellcat added armor plate behind the pilot's seat, bulletproof windscreens, and self-sealing fuel tanks. Where the Zero used fabric-covered control surfaces that became ineffective at high speeds, the Hellcat employed metal skinning and hydraulic boost, to maintain full control authority at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. The first production F-6 F-3 rolled off Grumman's Bethpage assembly line in October 1942, and deliveries to Fighting Squadron 9 began in early 1943. The aircraft quickly demonstrated characteristics that pilots found almost miraculous compared to the Wildcat. The massive engine provided power for everything: speed to escape unfavorable engagements, climb rate to regain altitude advantage, and raw acceleration that could build deadly diving attacks. The structural strength meant pilots could maneuver aggressively without fear of overstressing the airframe. The 650 caliber machine guns delivered concentrated firepower that could destroy lightly built Japanese aircraft with short bursts. But raw performance alone does not win air battles. The Hellcat arrived in the Pacific accompanied by tactical doctrine specifically developed to exploit Zero weaknesses identified from the Akutan aircraft tests. American pilots were explicitly taught to never dogfight Zeros at low speeds where the Japanese aircraft retained turning advantages. Instead, Hellcat doctrine emphasized vertical attacks, diving from altitude to build speed, making a single firing pass, then using excess speed to climb back to attacking position before the Zero could respond. The tactics transformed air combat from a horizontal chess match into a three-dimensional war of physics, where American engineering advantages mattered more than pilot finesse. On August 31, 1943, F-6F Hellcats from USS Essex and USS Yorktown made their combat debut attacking Marcus Island. The mission was an overwhelming success, with no Japanese fighters managing to get airborne and several destroyed on the ground. 2 Hellcats were lost to anti-aircraft fire, but not a single aircraft was lost in air-to-air combat. It was an auspicious beginning, but not yet proof of dominance. That proof would come at Tarawa, November 23 and 24, 1943. American forces were conducting amphibious landings at Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, a critical step in the island-hopping campaign that would carry the war toward Japan. Japanese air forces from Rabaul and other bases launched desperate counterstrikes to disrupt the invasion. Over 2 days of furious air combat, Hellcats from multiple carrier fighter squadrons engaged waves of Japanese aircraft, including substantial numbers of Zeros. The results shocked both sides. American pilots claimed 30 Japanese fighters destroyed for the loss of a single F-6F. The actual numbers may have been slightly different, accounting for overclaiming common in the chaos of combat, but the ratio was undeniable. Japanese commanders receiving these reports struggled to understand what had happened. Tarawa was not supposed to be possible. The Zero remained the same aircraft that had dominated for 2 years. The pilots, while less experienced on average than pre-Midway veterans, were still trained to the standards that had produced air superiority throughout the Pacific. What changed was not Japanese capability, but American capability. The Hellcat represented a quantum leap that Japanese intelligence had failed to anticipate, and Japanese industry could not counter. Flight Petty Officer Shigeo Matsushita, one of the few survivors of the Tarawa engagement, filed a combat report that revealed the psychological impact. He described American fighters that refused to turn with him, instead making slashing vertical attacks at speeds he could not match. When he attempted to follow one diving Hellcat, his Zero's controls became impossibly heavy, and he had to break off or risk structural failure. When he tried to climb after another, the American aircraft simply outclimbed him despite the Zero's theoretical advantage below 14,000 feet. Matsushita had trained for 3 years to fly the Zero. He had accumulated over 800 hours flight time. He understood every aspect of his aircraft's performance envelope and had internalized tactics that had won countless engagements against Wildcats. None of it mattered against the Hellcat. The American fighters were not just marginally better, they operated in a different regime of combat, where his training and aircraft were simply obsolete. His report concluded with words that must have stung. We could not effectively engage the enemy under any conditions that day. Other reports from Tarawa and subsequent engagements told similar stories. Japanese pilots described Americans who attacked once from high altitude, then climbed away before defensive maneuvers could develop. They reported that when hits were scored on Hellcats, the American aircraft absorbed damage and continued fighting, while Zeros struck by even brief bursts frequently exploded or burst into flames. Most disturbingly, they noted that American pilots seemed to know exactly how to fight Zeros, exploiting weaknesses Japanese pilots themselves had not fully understood. This last point was not paranoia. American tactical doctrine had been literally written based on test flights of the Akutan Zero. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders had conducted systematic evaluation flights in September and October 1942, quantifying precisely which maneuvers the Zero could and could not perform effectively. His reports documented the high-speed aileron problems, the negative acceleration engine failure, the structural limitations, and the fragility under fire. These findings had been distributed throughout the fleet and incorporated into training programs. Every Hellcat pilot deploying to the Pacific had been briefed on how to beat the Zero using tactics validated by flying the actual enemy aircraft. Commander Masatake Okumiya, still serving as an air operations staff officer, understood immediately that Tarawa represented something more than a bad day. In his post-war book, Zero, co-written with Zero designer Jiro Horikoshi and American author Martin Caden, Okumiya wrote, "Our first reports on the new Grumman stated that its design had been affected by a careful American examination of a Zero fighter captured in the Aleutians in the spring of 1942. To some extent, this appeared to be so." He went on to state that the recovery of Koga's Zero, which seemed trivial at the time, had almost as long-term an effect on the Pacific War as the loss of Nagumo's 4 carriers at Midway. This was not hyperbole from a defeated officer seeking to explain away failure. It was recognition that the Americans had systematically analyzed Japanese strengths and engineered solutions, while Japanese industry and doctrine remained frozen in assumptions that had worked brilliantly in 1941, but were catastrophically obsolete by late 1943. The problem was not that Japanese pilots lacked courage or skill. The problem was they were fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's aircraft against an enemy that had leapfrogged ahead in both technology and tactics. The news from Tarawa rippled through Japanese naval aviation from forward bases to fleet headquarters to the Navy Ministry in Tokyo. Staff officers analyzing the reports understood the implications immediately. If the Americans could achieve 30-to-1 kill ratios, Japanese air power would be bled white within months. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Japan entered the war with approximately 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots and had not significantly expanded training capacity to replace losses. America was now producing thousands of pilots annually and equipping them with aircraft that were categorically superior to anything in Japanese service. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, preparing to command Japan's mobile fleet in what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea, received reports about Hellcat performance with growing alarm. His carriers were being re-equipped with aircraft and pilots to replace the devastating losses at Midway and subsequent attrition. But intelligence suggested that even when his carrier groups were at full strength, they would be facing American squadrons with better aircraft, better trained pilots, despite shorter individual training time and tactics specifically designed to exploit Zero weaknesses. The strategic implications were catastrophic. Japanese plans for the decisive fleet engagement that would destroy American carrier power and force a negotiated peace required air superiority. If Hellcats could systematically destroy Japanese strike aircraft, both fighters and bombers, at ratios approaching 30-to-1, no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome those mathematics. Every engagement would cost Japan irreplaceable pilots and aircraft, while American losses would be replaced within weeks from training schools and factories producing aircraft at rates Japan could not match. Through late 1943 and into early 1944, the pattern established at Tarawa repeated across the Pacific. Hellcats swept Japanese aircraft from the skies over the Marshall Islands, the Solomon Islands, and Rabaul. American pilots, many of them relatively inexperienced with just months of training compared to the years Japanese pilots had once received, consistently outfought their opponents, not through superior flying skill in traditional dogfighting, but through exploiting systematic advantages in aircraft performance and tactical doctrine. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, flying F-6Fs from USS Yorktown, shot down 3 Zeros in a single engagement in February 1944 during attacks on the Japanese stronghold at Truk. His combat report described tactics that had become standard: position above enemy formations, dive to build speed exceeding 400 miles per hour, fire a brief burst during the high-speed pass, then zoom climb back to altitude before the enemy could react. Valencia noted that Zero pilots attempting to follow him into his dive either gave up when their controls became ineffective at high speeds, or in several documented cases, had their aircraft structurally fail from excessive acceleration loads. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was devastating. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces who survived the war, described in his post-war memoir, encountering 15 Hellcats near Iwo Jima in June 1944. Despite his exceptional skill and experience, Sakai found himself fighting purely defensively, using every trick he had learned over years of combat simply to survive. He managed to shoot down 2 Hellcats through what he described as luck and their pilots' inexperience, but the engagement demonstrated that even Japan's best pilots in perfect flying conditions could do little more than survive against Hellcats flown by average American pilots. Sakai's account included telling details about the psychological shift. He described seeing Hellcats positioned above him, knowing they would dive, unable to climb fast enough to challenge them before they attacked, and recognizing that his only option was defensive maneuvering and hope. He wrote, "We could see them above us, sitting there like hawks. We knew they would dive. We knew we could not follow them when they did. And we knew that when they climbed back to altitude, they would dive again. We were not fighting pilots. We were fighting gravity, and you cannot outmaneuver gravity." Japanese commanders attempted various tactical responses. Some units tried maintaining tighter formations with mutually supporting fighters. This helped survival rates slightly, but made offensive operations against American bombers nearly impossible, as all fighters focused on defense rather than escort. Some units tried altitude advantages of their own, but Hellcats climbed fast enough to negate this tactic and could simply refuse combat until conditions favored them. Some units tried nocturnal operations to avoid the overwhelming American daylight fighters, which worked until American Hellcat night fighter variants equipped with radar began appearing in mid-1944. None of these adaptations addressed the fundamental problem that the Zero was obsolete against the Hellcat. Japanese industry developed improved variants, including the A6M5 Model 52 with slightly better performance and the A6M6 with self-sealing fuel tanks, but these incremental improvements could not close the gap. More capable replacement fighters like the Kawanishi N1KJ were under development, but would not enter service in meaningful numbers until late 1944, far too late to affect the war's outcome. The other critical factor compounding Japanese difficulties was the continuing collapse of pilot training programs. As combat losses mounted through 1943 and into 1944, Japan faced impossible choices. Pull experienced pilots from combat units to serve as instructors, sacrificing immediate combat effectiveness for future capability, or keep veterans in combat where they died at accelerating rates while replacement pilots received increasingly abbreviated training. Japan chose the latter, maintaining frontline strength at the expense of the training pipeline. By mid-1944, Japanese replacement pilots were arriving at operational units with perhaps a third of the flight hours their predecessors had received. Fuel shortages, aircraft maintenance problems, and lack of qualified instructors all contributed to declining training quality. Where American pilots deploying to the Pacific in 1944 typically had over 500 hours of flight time and had practiced tactics extensively, Japanese replacement pilots might have 150 hours or less with minimal tactical training. The result was slaughter. New Japanese pilots facing experienced American Hellcat pilots flying superior aircraft with superior tactics had lifespans measured in missions rather than months. Even veteran Japanese pilots found themselves outnumbered and outmatched, forced to watch helplessly as inexperienced wingmen were picked off by coordinated Hellcat attacks. Admiral Ozawa, preparing for what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea, understood he was leading his aviators into a meat grinder. Intelligence reports indicated the Americans had over 15 carriers with hundreds of Hellcats. His own carriers embarked aircraft manned by pilots whose average experience had declined precipitously since Midway 2 years earlier. He would be attacking into the teeth of American combat air patrols guided by radar that would detect his strikes at ranges exceeding 100 miles, allowing Hellcats to position perfectly for vertical attacks before his formations even reached the American fleet. Ozawa's staff conducted wargames and simulations, trying to identify tactics that might work. The results were uniformly discouraging. Every scenario ended with Japanese losses far exceeding American casualties. The only variable was whether those losses would be catastrophic or merely disastrous. The Japanese Navy's plan for the decisive battle that would turn the war required air superiority. Intelligence made clear that air superiority was impossible against Hellcat-equipped American carriers. June 19, 1944. Philippine Sea, west of the Mariana Islands. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of the carrier Taiho and watched the first strike launch into the pre-dawn darkness. 370 aircraft from 9 Japanese carriers, the largest carrier aviation force assembled since Midway 2 years earlier. This was Operation Ago, the decisive battle that would destroy American carrier power and save the empire. Ozawa knew the odds were against him, but orders were orders and duty was duty. Within hours, his carefully husbanded aviation force would be annihilated in what American pilots would mockingly call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a massacre so one-sided it would permanently cripple Japanese naval aviation. The battle that unfolded over the next 2 days would validate every lesson learned from the Akutan Zero, every design decision in the F-6F Hellcat, and every tactical innovation developed since 1943. It would produce kill ratios that seemed impossible, statistics that Japanese commanders would struggle to believe even as the evidence mounted. And it would demonstrate conclusively that Japanese naval aviation, once the most feared air power in the Pacific, had become obsolete against American fighters flown by increasingly confident pilots who understood exactly how to win. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, operated 15 carriers, carrying approximately 480 F-6F Hellcats, plus dive bombers and torpedo aircraft. The carriers were arranged in 4 task groups spread across miles of ocean, each group built around fast battleships and heavy cruisers with destroyer screens. The formation had been specifically designed to maximize fighter coverage, with Hellcats maintained on combat air patrol at multiple altitudes, while others stood ready on deck for immediate launch when radar detected incoming threats. The American advantage began before a single shot was fired. Ship-based radar could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 150 miles, providing controllers with precise information on incoming raid strength, altitude, and bearing. This allowed Hellcat directors to position fighters optimally for interception, typically at higher altitudes and between the threat and the fleet. Japanese strike formations, lacking comparable radar, had no idea they were being tracked from the moment they came within detection range. The first Japanese strike, 69 aircraft including fighters and bombers, was detected at 1000 hours on June 19, approximately 150 miles west of the American fleet. Mitcher immediately ordered all available fighters aloft and turned Task Force 58 into the wind to facilitate continuous launches. Within minutes, over 300 Hellcats were airborne at staggered altitudes from 10,000 to 25,000 feet, creating layered defenses that incoming Japanese aircraft would have to penetrate. The initial interception occurred at 70 miles from the fleet when American fighters made contact with the Japanese formation. What followed was systematic destruction. Hellcat pilots, positioned at higher altitudes with the sun behind them, dove through the Japanese formation in coordinated attacks. The dive attacks built speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, allowing brief firing passes before zooming back to altitude. Zero escorts attempting to engage found themselves unable to follow the vertical maneuvers, their controls heavy and unresponsive at the speeds Hellcats operated comfortably. Within the first 25 minutes of combat, 42 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The survivors, scattered and disorganized, continued toward the American fleet, where they encountered additional Hellcat combat air patrols and withering anti-aircraft fire. Of the original 69 aircraft in the first strike, only 27 reached attack positions. These achieved no significant damage, scoring near misses but no hits on American ships. The entire first wave was effectively destroyed, with only fragments returning to Japanese carriers. Commander David McCampbell, leading Air Group 15 from USS Essex, was airborne during the initial intercepts. His combat report described Japanese formations that seemed confused by the ferocity and coordination of American attacks. He noted that many Japanese pilots, likely recent graduates with minimal combat experience, attempted to turn with attacking Hellcats rather than using vertical maneuvers that might have given them chances to escape. Those who did try diving away found Hellcats could follow them through any maneuver, while climbing was suicide as Hellcats above simply waited for them to stall out. The second Japanese strike, launched at 0900 hours and comprising 128 aircraft, fared even worse. American radar tracked the formation from 140 miles out, allowing perfect positioning of intercepting Hellcats. This strike was met by over 50 American fighters positioned in layers from 12,000 to 20,000 feet. The slaughter began before the Japanese formation even got organized for their attack run. Within 30 minutes, 97 of the 128 aircraft had been shot down. The remaining 31 scattered in all directions, with some attempting to reach Guam to refuel and regroup. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, flying as McCampbell's wingman, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in a single 8-minute engagement during the second wave intercept. His gun camera footage, analyzed after the battle, showed the same pattern repeatedly. Hellcat diving from altitude, closing at combined speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, brief burst of concentrated 50 caliber fire, enemy aircraft exploding or bursting into flames, Hellcat zooming back to altitude. Each kill averaged less than 2 seconds of actual firing time. Vrasiu's combat report included observations that illuminated why the kill ratios were so lopsided. He noted that most Japanese aircraft he attacked showed no awareness of his approach until he opened fire, despite attacking from angles that should have been visible to alert pilots. He described return fire as sporadic and poorly aimed, suggesting either inexperienced gunners or pilots too overwhelmed to coordinate effective defense. Most tellingly, he noted that every aircraft he hit either exploded immediately or caught fire within seconds, demonstrating the catastrophic vulnerability of Japanese aircraft lacking armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The third, Japanese strike, 47 aircraft launched around 1000 hours, achieved essentially nothing. Intercepted 50 miles from the American fleet, this wave lost 7 aircraft immediately, and the remaining 40 turned back without pressing attacks. The psychological collapse was evident. Japanese pilots who had launched expecting to destroy American carriers found themselves facing coordinated defenses that seemed impossible to penetrate. Many chose survival over pressing hopeless attacks. The fourth wave, 82 aircraft launched between 1100 hours and 1130 hours, received incorrect position information for the American fleet and wandered lost across the Philippine Sea. One group stumbled upon Rear Admiral William Montgomery's task group and lost half their number in the brief engagement that followed. The larger group flew toward Guam, hoping to refuel and regroup, only to be intercepted over Orote Field by 27 Hellcats while attempting to land. In the aerial slaughter over Guam, 30 of 49 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, and the rest damaged beyond repair. By sunset on June 19th, Japanese carrier aviation had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of approximately 370 aircraft launched that day, only 130 returned to their carriers. The Americans lost 29 aircraft total, with many pilots recovered from the ocean. The kill ratio across the entire day's combat exceeded 10-1, with some individual engagements reaching 30-1. These were not numbers produced by overwhelming numerical superiority, but by systematic, technical and tactical advantages that rendered Japanese aircraft and pilots unable to compete. Japanese pilots who survived described the engagement in terms that revealed complete demoralization. One Zero pilot rescued after ditching near Guam reported that American fighters seemed to appear from nowhere at impossible speeds, strike once with devastating effect, then vanish before defensive maneuvers could develop. He stated that in 3 combat missions that day, he never achieved a firing solution on an American aircraft, despite multiple attempts to engage. Another survivor, a bomber pilot whose aircraft limped back to the carrier Zuikaku with over 50 bullet holes, described Hellcats that attacked his formation from directly above in nearly vertical dives. He estimated closing speeds that made return fire impossible, and noted that several aircraft in his formation exploded from single brief bursts. His aircraft survived, he believed, only because American pilots selected other targets first and ran out of ammunition before engaging him. Admiral Ozawa, receiving reports throughout the day on board Taiho, watched his carefully rebuilt air groups being destroyed in real time. By mid-afternoon, it was clear Operation Ago had failed catastrophically. Not only had his strikes achieved no significant damage to American carriers, but the losses meant his own carriers were now virtually defenseless. The second day of battle would only compound the disaster. On June 20th, American search aircraft finally located the Japanese fleet late in the afternoon, approximately 275 miles west of Task Force 58. Admiral Mitcher made the controversial decision to launch a full strike despite the extreme range and approaching darkness. Over 200 aircraft, including 95 Hellcats serving as fighters and fighter-bombers, flew toward the Japanese fleet, knowing they would have to return and land after dark, a dangerous prospect, even in peacetime. The strike arrived over the Japanese carriers just before sunset. The 35 or so fighters Ozawa could put up, all that remained of the hundreds launched the previous day, were quickly overwhelmed. American aircraft sank the carrier Hio, damaged carriers Zuikaku, Junyo, and Chiyoda, and destroyed multiple oilers and support ships. American losses were 20 aircraft in combat, with an additional 80 aircraft lost or damaged in the harrowing night recovery that followed. Many pilots ditched near the fleet and were rescued, but the Battle of the Philippine Sea had proven beyond doubt that Hellcats had achieved complete air superiority. The strategic consequences were permanent and devastating for Japan. The carrier air groups destroyed in the Philippine Sea represented Japan's last concentrated aviation force. The experienced pilots killed in the battle could not be replaced. The carriers survived, but without trained air groups they were effectively useless. Japanese naval aviation would never again threaten American carrier operations. The battle marked the end of Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. Japanese commanders analyzing the battle reports struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the defeat. The kill ratios seemed impossible, suggesting either wildly inaccurate American claims or a level of Japanese incompetence that contradicted years of successful operations. But interviews with surviving pilots confirmed the statistics. The Hellcats had simply outclassed Zeros so completely that numerical comparisons became meaningless. Commander Masatake Okumiya, by this point serving in Homeland Defense, read the battle reports with a profound sense of vindication and despair. His warnings about declining pilot quality and the need for aircraft that could match American technological advances had been ignored by senior commanders who believed Japanese spirit could overcome material disadvantages. The Philippine Sea proved conclusively that spirit without capability achieved only death. In his post-war writings, Okumiya would analyze the battle as the inevitable result of systemic failures dating back to before Midway. Japan had entered the war with superb pilots and adequate aircraft, then failed to expand training capacity to replace losses, while American industry produced both superior aircraft and trained pilots at rates Japan could not match. The captured Zero at Akutan had accelerated American understanding of how to defeat Japanese aviation, but even without that intelligence, the outcome would have been similar given the fundamental disparity in industrial capacity and training systems. The psychological impact of the Philippine Sea extended beyond the immediate battle. Japanese pilots throughout the Pacific, hearing reports of the massacre, understood they were fighting a losing war. The mystique of the Zero, already badly tarnished by a year of combat against Hellcats, evaporated completely. American intelligence reports from late 1944 documented what they termed zero fatigue, a phenomenon where Japanese pilots increasingly avoided combat when possible rather than pressing attacks against Hellcats they knew they could not defeat. Saburo Sakai, reflecting on the battle years later, wrote that the Philippine Sea marked the moment when Japanese pilots stopped believing they could win. Not individual engagements, but the war itself. The mathematics were too clear. Every mission cost Japan irreplaceable pilots and aircraft, while American losses were replaced within weeks. The cumulative effect was a death spiral, where declining pilot quality led to higher losses, which required pulling even less trained replacements from abbreviated training programs, further increasing loss rates in an unbreakable cycle. The F-6F Hellcats' dominance continued through the final year of the war, but with decreasing resistance as Japanese aviation disintegrated. By late 1944, Japanese tactics shifted increasingly toward kamikaze attacks, using minimally trained pilots for one-way suicide missions against American ships. This was not some mystical embodiment of Bushido spirit, but a rational recognition that conventionally trained pilots could not survive against Hellcats long enough to accomplish meaningful attacks. Better to use barely trained pilots who needed only to know how to take off, navigate to the target, and crash into a ship. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, in October 1944, demonstrated the complete collapse of Japanese conventional naval aviation. F-6F Hellcats, operating from Admiral William Halsey's carriers, systematically destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft during 4 days of operations. American losses were minimal, with most coming from anti-aircraft fire rather than air-to-air combat. Commander McCampbell, leading Air Group 15, shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single mission on October 24, bringing his total to 34 kills, all scored in Hellcats, making him the Navy's highest-scoring ace of the war. McCampbell's October 24 mission exemplified Hellcat tactics refined over a year of combat. Flying with wingman Ensign Roy Rushing, McCampbell intercepted a Japanese strike package of approximately 60 aircraft heading toward the American invasion fleet. Rather than immediately engaging, he climbed to 23,000 feet and positioned between the enemy formation and the Sunday. When Zero escorts descended to engage lower-altitude American fighters, McCampbell attacked. His first pass was textbook vertical doctrine, a 65-degree dive-building speed to over 400 miles per hour, a 2-second burst that destroyed a Judy dive bomber, then a pull-out generating over 5 Gs that sent him rocketing back to 20,000 feet. The entire attack sequence took less than 30 seconds from dive initiation to return to altitude. He repeated this pattern 9 times over the next 90 minutes, each time diving from altitude, firing a brief burst, then climbing away before Japanese fighters could react. McCampbell's 9th kill came with his ammunition nearly exhausted, and fuel gauge showing less than 20 gallons remaining. He had been airborne for nearly 2 hours, most of it at combat power settings that should have emptied his tanks after 90 minutes. But the mission demonstrated everything the Hellcat and its tactics had been designed to accomplish. Energy management in the vertical dimension, refusing to fight on enemy terms, using superior aircraft performance to dictate engagement conditions absolutely. The final statistics for the F-6F Hellcat compiled at war's end told a story of dominance unprecedented in aviation history. Hellcats were credited with destroying 5,163 enemy aircraft in Pacific air-to-air combat by United States Navy and Marine Corps pilots, accounting for approximately 75% of all Navy aerial victories during the war. Only 270 F-6Fs were lost to enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, producing an overall kill ratio of 19-1. Against Zeros specifically, the ratio was approximately 13-1 when accounting for all Japanese aircraft types engaged. The Hellcat produced 305 to 307 Navy aces, pilots with 5 or more victories, more than any other Allied aircraft in World War II. The aircraft achieved these results despite not entering combat until September 1943, fighting for only the final 22 months of the war. These numbers represented more than technical superiority. They represented the culmination of systematic analysis of enemy capabilities, engineering designed to exploit identified weaknesses, tactical doctrine developed from testing captured enemy aircraft, and training programs that produced pilots who understood how to use their advantages. The Hellcat was not dramatically faster than the Zero. It was not more maneuverable in traditional dogfighting, but it excelled in the regime of combat that mattered. Vertical energy management at high speeds where structural strength and engine power dominated over turning ability. For Japanese commanders, watching their aviation forces being systematically destroyed, the Hellcat represented everything that had gone wrong with their war effort. Where Japan had entered the conflict with qualitative superiority in aircraft and pilots, assuming that quality would compensate for quantitative disadvantages, America had developed both quantity and quality. Grumman produced 12,275 Hellcats in approximately 37 months, roughly 1 aircraft per hour at peak production. Japan produced approximately 10,500 Zeros over the entire war, spanning 5 years. But production numbers alone do not explain the kill ratios. The critical factor was the systematic exploitation of intelligence gathered from the Akutan Zero and subsequent captures. American engineers and tacticians had literally studied the enemy's primary weapon, identified every weakness, and designed both an aircraft and tactical doctrine to exploit those weaknesses ruthlessly. Japanese commanders, lacking comparable intelligence on American development programs, were repeatedly surprised by new aircraft and tactics that countered their advantages. Commander Okumiya, writing in the 1950s with the perspective of peace and access to American sources, would state definitively that the loss of Koga's intact Zero had almost as long-term an effect on the Pacific War as the loss of Nagumo's 4 carriers at Midway. This was not hyperbole. The 4 carriers cost Japan immediate striking power and experienced pilots. The captured Zero cost Japan the mystique of invincibility and gave America the blueprint for defeating Japanese aviation systematically. The broader lessons from the Hellcat's dominance resonated through post-war aviation development. The principle of using superior power and structural strength to fight in the vertical dimension became foundational doctrine for American fighter tactics. The F-15 Eagle, developed 30 years after World War II, embodied the same philosophy: sufficient power to climb and accelerate rapidly, structural strength to maneuver aggressively at high speeds, and weapons systems that allowed engagement on favorable terms. When the Navy established the Fighter Weapons School at Naval Air Station Miramar in 1969, the program that became famous as Top Gun, the first tactical manual included sections on energy management and vertical maneuvering that directly cited World War II Pacific combat reports. Instructors required students to study Hellcat tactics, particularly the battles of 1944, to understand how systematic exploitation of aircraft advantages could overcome opponents with superior traditional dogfighting capabilities. The F-6F Hellcat itself remained in service only briefly after World War II. By 1954, just 9 years after combat ended, the last Navy Hellcat was retired, replaced by jets and more modern propeller fighters that made the F-6F obsolete. But the principles it embodied, power over agility, structural strength over weight savings, systematic tactics over improvisational skill, became timeless elements of American fighter doctrine. For the Japanese pilots who faced Hellcats through 1943, 1944, and 1945, the experience represented a profound reversal of fortune. Men who had entered the war confident of their aircraft's superiority and their own superior training found themselves outmatched by younger, less experienced American pilots flying aircraft specifically designed to negate Japanese advantages. The psychological impact was devastating, transforming air combat from a contest of skill into a systematic slaughter where survival rather than victory became the realistic goal. The few Japanese aces who survived the war, men like Saburo Sakai, who lived to write memoirs, described the Hellcat period as the moment they understood the war was lost. Not because individual battles went badly, but because the mathematics were inescapable. Every engagement cost Japan irreplaceable resources, while American strength grew continuously. The kill ratios, whether 10-1 or 19-1 or 30-1 in individual engagements, all pointed toward the same conclusion. Japanese aviation could not sustain operations against Hellcat-equipped American forces. The final irony was that the Zero, which had represented cutting-edge design in 1940 and dominated the Pacific for 2 years, became obsolete not because Japanese engineers failed, but because they had optimized for the wrong parameters. By prioritizing range, maneuverability, and weight savings over protection, structural strength, and high-speed performance, the Zero excelled in the air combat regime of the 1930s and early 1940s. But American engineers, armed with detailed intelligence from captured Zeros, designed for a different regime where physics mattered more than finesse. The Hellcat proved that in modern air combat, superior power and structural strength deployed through systematic tactics could overcome superior agility and experienced pilots. This lesson, purchased with the lives of thousands of Japanese aviators, would echo through decades of subsequent fighter development. The age of the maneuverable lightweight fighter ended over the Pacific in 1944, replaced by an era where power, speed, and systematic tactics dominated. For Japanese commanders receiving reports of 19-1 kill ratios, the statistics represented military catastrophe and the death of a doctrine. For American pilots flying Hellcats, the numbers validated years of development work, the intelligence gathered from a single captured Zero, and tactical innovations that transformed air combat. For aviation historians, the Hellcat versus Zero confrontation demonstrates how systematic analysis of enemy capabilities, combined with superior industrial capacity and sound, tactical doctrine, can achieve dominance that seems almost impossible until examined in detail. The story of the F-6F Hellcat is ultimately the story of American industrial and intellectual power, overwhelming Japanese qualitative advantages through systematic effort. It is the story of how a single captured Zero, carefully analyzed and tested, provided intelligence that influenced both aircraft design and tactical doctrine. And it is the story of how 19-1 kill ratios, numbers that seemed impossible, became routine when every advantage aircraft performance, pilot training, tactical doctrine, and strategic intelligence aligned to create overwhelming superiority. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.